was 17 years old when he was sold into slavery. And he was 30 years old when Pharaoh sent him up. So for 13 years, I mean, you know, we're going to talk about all the things that happened to him, yet there was a purpose why God did that. And we'll talk about that.
But it's just further proof that, I just can't see how that could develop from one cell into a person that's so complicated and so, I mean, everything in your body ties together. And
Yeah, you're right.
I mean, it had to be created.
It brings to mind, you or I or somebody was talking, we said, we think about all the things that men have created, and not all they're doing is rearranging what God's already created.
Right.
You know, all that. So it's amazing. You know, right now there's, I don't know if you read some of these science articles, there's things that's this propellant to escape the atmosphere that require, they've developed thrust that doesn't require propellant. And you go, that's amazing. And now they're actually looking at, again, being able to travel at the speed of light. And there's advancements being made. You know, but think about it, that's why God at the Tower of Babel, why he separated everybody. He said if he left them alone, they would just destroy themselves. And I think we're back to that same period where man thinking they're going to create and develop everything. Anyway, off track. All right, so we are continuing in our study of Genesis. We've got 2 more weeks, and then I think in about 3 weeks, this is session 11, I think there's 13 sessions. And then in 3 weeks, we're going to go to the New Testament. We're going to start in the book of Acts. And then probably, well, I know at least a week prior, we'll be issuing out the new books for everybody on that. But today is session 11. It's Genesis chapter 41. It's verses 14 to 21. And even though it skips 11 verses, we're going to talk about them. And then it goes back to 33 through 37, and then a little bit more on that. The lesson is called Revealed. And in there, the theme of our lesson is that God reveals his plans when we trust him. And so keep that in mind as we get into our lesson today. But the 13 verses that are actually in your book is broken down into 3 parts. The first 3 verses is called credit given. The next 5 verses is called, it's kind of fun, it's called cow consumed. And then the last 5 verses are called plan defined. And so if we summarize our lesson today, we're going to see in the first 3 verses, we're going to see where Joseph, who's been in the king's prison for a number of years, is summoned and prepared to appear before Pharaoh. And he goes in front of Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, you know, basically, I've heard you can interpret dreams. Will you interpret mine? And Joseph's going to tell him, I can't. But he qualifies this. I cannot in of myself interpret the dream, but he gives credit to God who will provide the interpretation to Pharaoh. As we get in the next 5 verses, it's called cows consumed. And really what that's referring to is that Pharaoh actually has 2 dreams. We're going to talk about one of those today. Let's talk about both of them a little bit. But in one of his dreams, he sees 7 fat and healthy cows coming out of the river Nile, and it's followed by 7 skinny and sickly cows coming out as well. And then what happens is the sickly cows completely consume the healthy cows, yet their appearance doesn't change. They remain gaunt and scrawny. And then on the final ones, we get on the final 5 verses, it's called plan defined. And here's where Joseph explains, through God has given Joseph ability to explain the dreams where Egypt is going to have 7 years of abundance and prosperity, followed by 7 years of severe famine on that. But in addition to interpreting the dream, God, through Joseph, also gives a plan that's going to save the people of Egypt and prevent Egypt from being wiped out. And we're going to see how Pharaoh is so impressed with Joseph. And actually, this is probably the 2 verses after everything, but he's going to be so impressed is that he sets Joseph up as second in command only to him because of the plan and the wisdom and the wisdom was I'm looking for there on that. So that's kind of our lesson today. It's a pretty short lesson on that, but let's just briefly look at what we did last week. In our lesson last week, if we remember, Joseph in his role as overseer, or Joseph was in his role of overseer for Potiphar, But Potiphar's wife was consistently making sexual advances toward him, and Joseph flatly refused, and he was determined not to give in. And he told Potiphar's wife, he said, if I gave in to your advances, not only would it violate the trust that your husband and my master has given me, but more importantly, it ultimately would lead to a sin against God on that. And then we read where on an occasion, in the normal course of his duties, he was in Potiphar's house. He found himself in a very vulnerable and dangerous situation. He was alone with Potiphar's wife, and she took advantage of the situation, aggressively grabbed him, demanded that he sleep with her, and he fled. And when he fled, she grabbed hold of his garment. She was able to retain it. Now, she was humiliated, and she was out for revenge, so she took that garment, that circumstantial evidence, and used it to falsify a story and claim that Joseph had attacked her. And then when Potiphar comes home, she gives him this fake story and the trumped up charges, but she blames him. She says, you're the one that bought this Hebrew slave on that. And of course, Potiphar was infuriated. He threw Joseph into the king's prison. And even though Joseph had remained faithful and trustworthy to both Potiphar and to God, he was punished. But even in prison, God did not leave Joseph. And in fact, there was favor shown through Joseph to the warden. And as a result, God still honored Joseph in prison because of the purity of his life and because of his moral integrity. And so chapter 39 ended there really with Joseph in prison. And we saw the same thing happen with the warden that happened with Potiphar, is that the warden put his total confidence, his total trust went into Joseph because what he was seeing, he saw God blessed him. And so the warden said, you got it. You're in charge of everything inside these walls. And he didn't have to worry about anything. And that's where chapter 39 ended. Now chapter 40 is a story that we've all known and learned a long time ago. And this what happens here is that we have the story of Pharaoh's, two of his staff members, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And they had done something to infuriate the Pharaoh, and he was angry at him, and he threw both of them into prison. We put them into the same king's prison that Joseph is at. And the warden put Joseph over these two guys, and Joseph developed a friendship with them. And it doesn't say how long they were in there, but over time, he did, develop that relationship. And one day he comes in and he sees the baker and the chief cupbearer talking, and they look disturbed. And he asks, what's the matter? What's bothering y'all? And they said, we both had a dream last night, and we can't interpret it, and we don't know what it means. And Joseph said, well, with God's help, I probably can interpret those dreams for you. And so the chief cupbearer told him his dream, and he said, well, I understand that dream. It says in 3 days you're going to be released, you're going to go back to your position as chief cupbearer. The baker shared his dreams, and Joseph said, well, you're going to get out of here in 3 days, but you're not going back to your position. You're going to be executed, they're going to cut your head off, your body's going to be impaled on the pole, and the bird's going to eat the flesh off your bones. He said, wow, that's quite a difference on that deal. And so in 3 days they came to get him, but before the cupbearer left, Joseph said, please tell the Pharaoh about my position here. I was the servant to the captain of the guards. I did nothing wrong. I've been falsely imprisoned. Would you ask him to help me? And the chief cupbearer said, yes, I will. Well, we know that he didn't on that deal. And so that's how chapter 40 ends. Chapter 41 really begins the lead-in to our lesson today. So it's been 2 years since the chief cupbearer was let out of prison, 2 years since Joseph had interpreted their dreams, and he had forgotten about Joseph. But there's an event that's going to happen that he's going to remember that, and the event is that the Pharaoh has 2 dreams. He has 2 dreams in the same night, and one of the dreams is going to involve fat, healthy cows and skinny, sickly cows. The other dream is going to involve plump heads of grain and skinny heads of grain on that. Well, these dreams are bothering Pharaoh, and he wants to try to get an explanation for it. So he calls in all of his wise men and all of the magicians that are in the kingdom or in Egypt, and they come in, and it's during this period when the chief chief cupbearer is doing what he's supposed to do. He's bringing around the drinks and the cups and all that. And he hears this dream, and he sees that these wise men and magicians can't help Pharaoh. And so he then remembers his promise to Joseph. He says, Pharaoh, there is a young Hebrew man that used to be a servant to your captain of the guards, Potiphar. And 2 years ago, I had a dream. He accurately interpreted it. I think he might be able to help you. And so what I was saying earlier is that Joseph was 17 years old when he was sold into slavery, and 17 years old when he became, well, probably 17 or 18 by the time Potiphar had made him the overseer of his house. He may have only been in that role a couple of years before he was falsely accused and put in prison, but it's possible that Joseph has been in the king's prison 8 to 10 years at this time, because he is now 30 years old on that. And so our lesson begins today with the Pharaoh asking his servants, go get that young Hebrew and let's see if he can help me. So that's where we are today on that. So if you go to your books on page 102, the first 3 verses is called credit given on that. And in verse 14 it says, then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and they quickly brought him from the dungeon. He shaved, changed his clothes, and went to Pharaoh. So the fact that Pharaoh is summoning Joseph indicates that he thought there was credibility to what his cupbearer told him, so he wanted to see, in fact, could this young Hebrew help me? And so they quickly went to get him. Now, they weren't going to bring Joseph into the court of the king, of the Pharaoh, in the condition as a prisoner. You know, he would have been in dirty clothes and probably had a beard and whatever. In fact, it says they shaved him. It's the Hebrews. One of the reasons, well, let me back up. So the Egyptian culture is that the men shaved their face and their heads. A beard was associated with Egyptian gods, therefore only the Pharaoh adorned a beard on that. The Hebrews grew their beard, which was one of the reasons why the Egyptians despised them, because they grew their beards on that. However, for his audience with Pharaoh, they would have shaved his beard, shaved his head, taken a bath, and got new clothes. The other reason they probably would have shaved him, he's been in prison for 10 years, and there's probably lice involved there. So they're making sure that he is presentable when he goes in front of Pharaoh. And so what they've done is they've quickly gone, the Pharaoh has summoned him, they're getting him ready, and now he's on his way to see Pharaoh on that. When he shows up, the king immediately says, I've had a dream and no one can interpret it. Well, the pharaohs of that time believed themselves to be representatives of the gods. And therefore, they had a responsibility in that role to do what the gods told them to do. The dreams they had, they took as communication from the gods. That's why they had all of these wise men and magicians on their staff, per se. That's why they hired all these guys, or had them part of their court, in order to interpret these dreams. Well, in this case, they had not done that. So that's why he's brought Joseph in on that. And then he asks Joseph, he tells Joseph, I've been told by the cupbearer that you can interpret dreams. And that's what he says. But I have heard it said about you that I can hear a dream, and that you can hear a dream and interpret it. Well, Joseph was quick to say, no, not in and of myself can I interpret a dream, but the credit goes to God, who will interpret it. And he uses a funny word there. He says he will give you a favorable interpretation. And he said, well, what does that mean, a favorable interpretation? What it means is that there was going to be an accurate interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, but no matter how unpleasant or how harsh it may seem, whatever he was going to do was in the best interest of Pharaoh. And that's what it means, is that he would give him a favorable interpretation. So in 16 it says, I'm not able to, Joseph answered Pharaoh. It is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer on that. So here we have it. He's been taken out of prison. He's been there 8 to 10 years. He's cleaned up. He's dressed up. He's in front of Pharaoh. He's got an audience with Pharaoh. Pharaoh has an interest in him interpreting his dreams. Joseph says, absolutely, but it doesn't mean it's going to do it. God will give you that interpretation. So that's kind of where we are right now. And the other thing, like I said, there is that because the pharaohs thought themselves a representative of the gods, they had a responsibility again to ensure the prosperity and the peace of Egypt, and they had to get that through the directive of the gods, and this is where the dream came in. He believes this is something the gods are telling him on that. So if we go on page 104, as we continue, so you have Joseph in front of Pharaoh now, and Pharaoh is going to start telling him the dream on that. So the very first piece of the dream, Pharaoh tells, I'm standing on the banks of the Nile. On verse 17 it says, so Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile. This is quite significant to the dream. First of all, the Nile River is the life of Egypt. In ancient Egypt, the Nile River, figuratively and literally, the nation of Egypt was built around the Nile River. 90+% of the people of Egypt live within 4 miles of the river, through a fertile valley that goes down the whole length. That's where they lived on that. And so, and if you think about the Nile, I mean, there's a debate on which river is longer, the Amazon or the Nile. Some people say it's the Nile, some people say it's Amazon. There's only a few miles difference, but both of them are close to 4,200 miles long. The Nile River has its source in East Central Africa. It goes all the way, so the river flows north, empties into the Mediterranean Sea around the city of Alexandria there. So again, it's the life of the river on that. What's unique about Egypt in this part is that most of the countries at that time were dependent upon rain. Well, in Egypt really wasn't, because the river would flood every year, most of the times. It would deposit rich silt, black silt on the lands. The people then would come in with canals and dams and other irrigation, and they would be able to grow rich, abundant crops. Now, there's sometimes the river would flood more than it's supposed to, but for the most part, they were not dependent on the rain. So you can see why the significance was really important when he says, I'm standing on the bank of the Nile, because that is the lifebone of Egypt itself on that. And then he goes on to explain what he saw. So in verse 18, the first part of his dream should not have made any concern to Pharaoh. It says, when 7 well-fed, healthy-looking cows came up from the Nile and grazed along the reeds. So think about this. So it wasn't uncommon for cattle, but here again we're talking the cows. The cows actually were signs of fertility, both for humans and for agriculture. Here 7 fat, healthy cows. They're in the shallows of the Nile. They're grazing in the reeds and the marsh grass, okay? There's nothing unusual. That part of the dream did not concern Pharaoh at all. That's a common sight along the Nile at the time. Now we get into stuff that starts concerning Pharaoh. Immediately following the 7 fat, healthy cows, 7 skinny, scrawny, sickly cows come up. Again, 14 cows have come up out of the Nile, again signifying that there's something with this dream has to do with the river Nile itself as well on that. But he says, okay, 7 skinny cows, sickly cows have followed the 7 healthy cows, but then he says he has never, Pharaoh said, never has he seen 7 cows that were as sickly as that. He says, I've never seen such sickly ones as these in all the land of Egypt. So the first part of the dream, nothing to concern him. Second part of the dream, he's starting to get concerned. If you remember a couple weeks ago, I said there's 3 types of dreams in the Old Testament, really I guess in the Bible. There's a simple message dream. We talked about, hey, angel tells Joseph, take the child Jesus, Mary, go to Egypt. Nothing to interpret there. They did. He brought them back. And then you have simple figurative dreams. This was a case with, again, with Joseph sharing his dreams where the moon and the sun are bound down to the stars and the sheaves of grain. That was simple. It saw what happened. Then the third type of dream, we would call it complex figurative, complex imagery, complex symbolic. That's what this is. This type of dream requires somebody to interpret it. So the Pharaoh is sharing this dream. It's gone from very simple, good, pleasant, healthy cows to something, and now it's going to get even worse on that. So if you go to 20, it says, then the thin, sickly cows ate the first well-fed cows. Well, first of all, cows are herbivorous, right? They eat plants. They're not carnivorous. So there was something wrong with that dream when you got plant-eating cows eating other cows on that. So obviously this is a confusing Pharaoh. He's concerned here. And then what really was the final part is that those thin, sickly cows completely devoured those fat, healthy cows, yet their appearance never changed. They remained gaunt, they remained thin and sickly, and so then the thin, sickly cows ate the first 7 well-fed cows. When they had devoured them, you could not tell they had devoured them. Their appearance was as bad as it had been before. Then I woke up. The next 11 verses are not in our actual study, but you've got to know what happened there. I mean, just for the sake of it, and probably y'all read it anyway. This was the first of 2 dreams that Pharaoh had. He had a similar dream. In the second dream, the number 7 was in there also. There were 7 skinny heads of grain, and it said they swallowed 7 plump heads of grain. Again, it was a complex dream, complex imagery dream. But when Joseph heard that, he gave the interpretation to Pharaoh. If you remember on the cows that came up, 7 healthy cows were followed by 7 sickly cows. And what Joseph tells Pharaoh is that you will have 7 years of abundance and prosperity, followed by 7 years of severe famine on that. It doesn't say the source of the famine. There could be a number of sources of that famine. Again, we talked about Egypt really didn't rely on rain, but you could still have famine. You could have where the floods are immense and they're flooding the land when you should be harvesting, or flooding the land when you should be planting, and therefore you don't get your crops in. You could still have locusts, you could have hailstorms, you could have blight. So a number of things, but it doesn't say what. It just says is that you will have 7 years followed by 7 years of plentiful prosperity, followed by 7 years of severe famine. Here's kind of something. Do y'all know the worst famine that ever hit the world, when it happened and where it was?
Ireland.
Huh?
Ireland potato farm.
Well, that was a big one, but
The Dust Bowl.
Dust Bowl,
The
Oklahoma.
Dust Bowl.
it happened in our lifetime. But it's amazing. It was in China, 1959 to 1961, over 3 years. And because of economic mismanagement, radical farming methods that failed, and other things, 30 million people died in China in those 3 years. That's the worst recorded famine, death from famine, that's ever happened in the world on that deal. But anyway, so again, God is really now, but God is showing through Joseph to Pharaoh a glimpse of the future and giving Egypt an opportunity to prepare for what's coming. And that leads us into the next verses, which is really... Did I skip something here? I don't think so. No. So we're going to go to page 106 and 107 and verse 33. So between the last verse we had and this one, Joseph has explained the meaning of the dreams, 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of severe famine. You remember Joseph was brought out of prison, the king's prison, and was summoned by the Pharaoh to give an interpretation of the dreams, and he's done that. But God goes further than that. Through Joseph, God also provides a plan to Pharaoh, something that would allow the people to survive this famine and not let the country or not let the country be wiped away. And what I say there is, a lot of times during this period of time, when famine hit a country, it could decimate, it could completely just take away everybody in the country. You wouldn't have a country anymore. So the plan now that Joseph is fixing to share would ensure that the people of Egypt survive the famine and that the country is not wiped out on that. And so in verse 33 it says, "So now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt." So now what Joseph is telling me, God speaking there, is that, look, there is a plan here, but you got to identify somebody who is discerning and wise, and dedicate that person to come up with, implement, and execute a strategy that's going to allow your country to survive on that. And then when you get to 34, Joseph is laying out the plan. You know, he's going to talk about you got to establish overseers. Well, Joseph, I mean, he probably wasn't auditioning for this role, but you're going to see because of what he's offering, Pharaoh's going to recognize the wisdom that he has. So Joseph, again, God speaking through him, is going to talk about setting up overseers in order to prepare on this. And I'm going to go back and mention something. So the Pharaoh had two dreams. He had two dreams in the same night. Both dreams, different symbols, different imagery, but the same message. And what have we said before? When God repeats something, you can take it to the bank. The certainty that it's going to happen, and this was certain going to happen, it was imminent. And so there was an urgency to start preparing, because that basically the clock was starting right now. There was going to be 7 years to prepare for the 7 years, so a 14-year period there. So now Joseph is given a plan out there. He says he's going to establish overseers. And then he puts three parts to that plan. He says the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take 1/5. We're going to take 20% of every crop. Everything that is harvested, we're going to take 20% of that, and we're going to store it away. In addition, anything that's excessive, we're going to take 20, but if there's anything else left, we're going to take it too. And then we're going to establish these distribution points on all the cities down the Nile. Remember, 90+% of the people lived in a small strip of land going down the whole country there, and by the Nile. And so they're going to identify these cities, and they're going to build these distribution points there, and they're going to store all this food and this grain in there. So he laid out this plan. And so he said in verse 34, it says, let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the harvest of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. So for the 7 years that there's prosperity and abundance, 20% of everything that's grown is going to be stored away. Most of this is grain. And then if they didn't use some of it, it's going to be taken and stored away as well. Let them gather all the excess food, these good food during these good years that are coming. And then he says something else. Look, this will mean nothing unless you put your seal. And if you kept reading, he talks about the king takes his signet ring and puts it on his decree. It says that person you put in charge has to have your full authority. Otherwise, his plan is not going to work. So he says in verse 36, he says, verse 35, it says, under Pharaoh's authority, store the grain in the city so they may preserve it as food. So he had to have Pharaoh's authority to do that. And then 36 just reiterates what he already says. He says the food will be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine that will take place in the land of Egypt. And then what I had mentioned earlier, it says, then the country will not be wiped out by famine, because they knew that famine can completely decimate, kill all the people, and your country has really a small population left. So then this was the assurance that they could survive the 7 years of famine that were going to come following this. And so once Joseph had laid this out, in verse 37 it says, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. So here's Joseph. He's laid out his plan that God has given him. Everybody's nodding their heads, and there is a consensus among the people there is that this is a good plan. Now, if you kept reading in 38 and 39, and y'all know what happened, Pharaoh basically was so impressed with what Joseph had laid out, even though, Joseph had given credit to God, but Pharaoh said, you now are that person. And at that point, Pharaoh made Joseph second in command, only to him in all of Egypt. Joseph would have the responsibility for implementing the strategy that he just laid out. And so everything would rely on Joseph in order to save the people of Egypt during the, really not, to implement the strategy and then to distribute the food during the second 7-year period on that. But then we also know that because of that, he was able to save his own family, which we're going to talk about a little bit as well on that. So if you look at this lesson, and the title of the lesson is Revealed, and God reveals his plan when we trust him. And we talked a little bit about this earlier when Bill, you made your comments. If you look at Joseph's life, for 11 years in there, from the time he was 17 years old to the time he was 30, that's not 11 years, what is it? 13 years, right. There's a lot of hardships on Joseph. You know, he was hated by his brothers, he was thrown in a pit, he was almost murdered, he was sold into slavery. He was falsely accused, he was thrown into prison, he was forgotten in prison. He had gone from being the apple of his father Jacob's eyes through this, but now he's just been made second in command to the mightiest nation in all the world on that. And you know, over the past couple of weeks in here, we've had some discussions on why God did certain things His way. You know, we talk about, well, why did God go through Judah and all the things that happened there for the lineage to the Messiah? Why didn't He use Joseph? There's more in here about Joseph and what a good guy Joseph would. Why didn't God do that? And we talk about, well, it's not us to question that. And we really weren't. We were just talking on that. But as humans, we're incapable of understanding really what God, why God makes His decisions that He was. The Scriptures are full of instances where God's plan is developed and accomplished because He did it His way, right? And so God uses all the people, all the circumstances, and all things to accomplish His good purpose. And in fact, this is what I mentioned earlier, Paul in Romans 8:28 says that. He says, for in all things, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called to His, thank you, purpose. Man, I was stumbling all over that one. But if you think there's three parts in there, in all things in our lives, if we love Him, the bad things, the good things, the tragic things, it is working for the good of, maybe you don't feel it, maybe it's somebody else around you, but it's all part of God's purpose. And if you look at Joseph, and that's exactly what happened there, all of those years, 8 to 10 years in prison, all the stuff he went through, there was a purpose there on that. And then in our own lives as believers, we have to accept the fact that even though we may not see it, we may not know it in our lifetime, we will know it in eternity. I'm sure that the purpose of doing that. But Joseph had gone through all this, and God used that for a very specific purpose. And that purpose was that the Word of God would be distributed to the world. The Word would become flesh, the Messiah, our Savior. All of that happened in a way that was God's plan, even though we may not understand it. And it happened through trials and tribulations. And again, as just in our own life, we have to look at bad things that happen and go, why did it happen? But as believers, we have to know there's something there. If I love God, then there's something good is going to come out of this, even though I may not feel it on that.
Yeah, I'm thinking about something.
Go ahead.
I was thinking about Joseph and everything he went through. There's never any fault found in him. He stayed faithful, he stayed committed. And then when he went to Pharaoh, he interpreted that dream. Not only did he interpret the dream, but without even having to think, he told Pharaoh what to do to accomplish what God's will was. So that told Pharaoh that he had knowledge. I mean, that was his wisdom, but that was God also, and courage for him to step up to Pharaoh. And because Pharaoh never asked him, okay, how do I take care of this? He just asked him to interpret the dream.
That's right.
And Joseph stepped up on his own and said, this is what you need to do to fix it. So that just impressed me about how intelligent he had become and how faithful he was to God.
Well, if you remember last week, we talked about chapter 38 gave the story. It looked like it was an interlude to the story of Joseph. It looked completely out of place. It was Judah and his relationship with his sister or his daughter-in-law, yada, yada, yada. And it was there, I said, for a reason. It was the contrast with the moral integrity of Joseph versus the immoral behavior of his brother Judah on that deal. So Joseph, again, and then again, it goes back to well, why wasn't the line through Joseph? Everything Joseph is doing would suggest that would be the line of the Messiah, but we don't know that. In fact, somebody said because he married an Egyptian. Maybe so. Maybe so. I don't know. But it wasn't God's plan. The lineage came through Perez, on that, through Judah that way. But anyway, but I agree with you. Joseph went through a lot of hardships. Again, he never lost his faith, never lost his trust, never quit putting his trust into God on that bill.
And Pharaoh didn't ask, well, will you take the job?
No, I don't know. He said, you got it, big boy.
You got it.
Yeah, on that.
Well, and God was faithful to Joseph. He protected him, even though he had to go through a lot of trials. He could have been put to death probably when Pharaoh's wife
That's
falsely
exactly right.
accused him. He could have gotten injured or killed in prison, and he could have misinterpreted the dream or not had a solution. So God gave him what he needed along the
That's
way
right.
too.
God never abandoned him, showing favor through the warden and the prison warden on that. So again, God's plan, it's there, and we may not understand it, but it's there, and it's all for, it's for achieving his good purpose on that. Like I said, he uses all people, all circumstances, and all things to accomplish that.
When you're in the midst of the trials, though, it's hard to see that.
Yes,
A
it
friend
is.
quoted that verse to me when my dad was in a VA hospital and had been for many months and was having a horrible, horrible time. And I was mad. I said, well, this isn't any good for my dad.
Yeah. And you're right. But you as a believer, you have to go, okay, I don't see it. Something's good is going to come out of this because I love the Lord, and I know what that verse says on that, Cynthia.
It's not scriptural, but, I can't help but wonder, thinking when Joseph was elevated and taking care of business in Egypt, how Potiphar's wife was observing all of that. And I wonder if Potiphar didn't look at his wife kind of askance and go,
I bet she was feeling a little bit on edge when Joseph got put in that position
Yeah.
on that deal.
Yeah.
But we have to believe there was no revenge in Joseph's heart.
no, there was not.
Over
But
that.
still, people knew that she had accused him, knew what had happened.
Exactly.
Of course, the Bible doesn't tell us, but just my own human nature does.
Yeah. I've always wondered about that whole situation, thinking that Potiphar had to do something because she had told the servants and everyone he did that. But maybe he already had her number, right?
Well, we
So he
talked
knew
about
what she
that.
was capable of and not
He had
capable
to-
of.
he had to
So-
do something.
So, yeah, I think that was probably the case, that he only threw him in prison in the first place because too many people knew the accusation and he had to not be publicly humiliated.
Again, conjecture, but I agree.
Yes.
Well, I read somewhere one time that Potiphar, I don't think Potiphar wanted to have to put Joseph in prison, but he really didn't. That's why he wasn't killed. He didn't have him killed. But his wife, had he not taken her side, he would have had to have her put to death. So he kind of saved both of them by not killing Joseph and by not having to kill her.
That's even more conjecture than I can come up with.
And I would like to go back and ask Potiphar if he regrets that decision of not having her killed.
Well, I don't know that you might not be able to do that one day. I don't know.
No, sorry.
But that had to take place to get him from the Potiphar position with Potiphar to Pharaoh.
Right.
He became second,
Second to
he
the
was the one under
Powerful
Pharaoh.
man.
And he would have never made that if that incident wouldn't have happened.
That's a good point.
And also, what I think about sometimes is, what is it, the cupbearer that he promised him that I'll share this with Pharaoh, and he waited 2 years.
forgot totally. Yeah.
So that tells you something had to take place in those 2 years for God to get all of the, so you know what I mean? You can't help but think that significance of the 2 years. I mean, why didn't that guy just go and share that, you know? I mean,
It's kind of like, he ain't going to have this dream for 2 years, therefore he cannot be available
Yeah,
for 2 years.
it's all in God's timing, I guess is what I was saying.
Yeah. The need, the Pharaoh didn't have a need until his magicians and wise men couldn't help him.
Right, meanwhile, Joseph's still in prison, you know? It's not
Yeah.
like- yeah.
Okay, let's go ahead and go, oh, yeah, Cynthia.
This isn't in the lesson, but some of the readings I was doing was talking about how Joseph is considered a signal, a sign, a type, a shadow of Christ.
Christ, yeah.
And how Potiphar did, as you were saying, did try to give him a way to be surviving this. And the same thing with Pilate. Pilate tried to give Christ, you know,
So as we search our heart and our mind for a way to get the wisdom and knowledge and insight that we need to honor you in all that we do. Be with us this week. Keep us out of harm's way. Bless our pastors today as that we also continue to hear your word and let it apply to our life as well. Thank you for hearing our prayers today for those that have special needs of comfort and healing, knowing full well, Lord, that you hear it and you answer in your way, and we accept that your will be done. As always, Lord, everything is done in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Amen. All right, thank you all.